strategic growth, First American Title, DFW Metroplex, state of Texas, and now the country as a whole. So today, instead of talking about title and putting everyone to sleep, which I most assuredly will do, yesterday I gave like a 45-minute to an hour-long economic panel in front of about 50 people, and so I thought I would just take a couple pieces of that, and we'll discuss sort of where I see the economy is today. Fair enough?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start with some things that I think are important to understand, right? And especially in this room, inflation and mortgage rates. So when we talk about inflation, and this most of you may know this, but I always like to review it just to be safe. There are two generally accepted measures of inflation, right? There's the CPI and the PCE, excuse me. The CPI is the Consumer Price Index, right? And the reason I don't lean as heavily on that inflation measure is because it's a fixed basket of goods. So what does that mean? It means when they measure that inflation metric every month, they are asking the same questions about the same basket of goods year over year. There's no assumption that the American consumer may have a varying degree of interest in goods in their basket, right? So I don't subscribe to that inflation metric, but it is a popular inflation metric you will see. And as you can see with the CPI, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they track this metric by surveying consumers about what they're buying. Okay, so that's the first metric, CPI. You'll see that on the line. Second metric, personal consumption expenditure, PCE. This is the metric that I prefer. One, here we're measuring a variable basket, right? The PCE accounts for that point I made just a moment ago, which is consumers are going to have varying interests. Accordingly, the PCE will update every so often to include a different variable in the basket. For example, if you were tracking PCE from like 1996 forward and the goods in the basket, you would notice that technology goods appear in the basket suddenly, right? Because more spending is being devoted toward tech advancement. So just an example of things of that nature. This is why the Fed prefers PCE as their inflation measure. So when we talk about the Fed and they're measuring inflation, they are usually going to look at PCE for that very specific reason. Now, more to the point, PCE is measured by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And what they do is instead of asking consumers about what they're purchasing, they actually track the data from businesses who have done transactions in accounts tables, right? So to me, PCE gives us a much more spot-on view of where the inflation metric is in the economy today. Does that make sense? Any questions on those 2 points before I continue? Fantastic. So just a couple of things I want to point out then. So what we have here is a macro view of CPI and the Metroplex. And now you may say, well, why would you show CPI? You just said you don't like that. I don't, but you can't measure a Metroplex by PCE. When you measure Metroplexes, all you can do is CPI because you're using consumer data. Does that make sense? It's varying degrees of impossible to track accounts tables for a Metroplex the size of DFW, okay? And I use this chart because it's pretty dramatic and pretty obvious and pretty hard to miss the point. We don't have an inflation problem in DFW, period. Not up for debate, end of sentence. And so I always want everybody to see that chart because you can see how dramatically in the last 3 years DFW has handled the problem that was inflation not that long ago. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that we have what's known as our PCE inflation report for America right here. Okay, and it's got 2 columns. And the reason I like to show, it's got 2 rows. And the reason I like to show these 2 rows is because they give different opinions. So this is the overall PCE for America, and the last time it was measured, December 2025. It shows that inflation is about 2.9%. Now that is steadily creeping up from the summer, as we can see, right? 6, 7, 8, 7, 8, 9, steadily creeping up. But for my money, an inflation metric that is south of 3.0, I'm still going to be comfortable with that, right? We've locked in on this number of 2%. And my pet peeve with the number 2% is that we didn't create it ourselves. It's not an American metric based on our GDP and our numbers. It's a metric that was created in New Zealand in the 1980s because they were the first country to really sort of look at inflation and measuring it to that degree. So we just took New Zealand's inflation metric and said, yeah, that'll work. That's literally what happened. So to me, I'm always going to have some degree of hesitation when I look at that metric. Does that make sense? The last thing I want to show you before we switch slides over is a trend mean on the PCE. So what does that mean, the trend mean? It means that there are going to be different price categories from time to time that have really dramatic jumps. So right now, beef and eggs have really dramatic price spikes, right? As a result, it raises the overall PCE, and it makes it look like inflation is more aggressive than it is. If you strip those real exceptions out of the measurement, then you get trimmed PCE, and that shows you where is our inflation on a nominal day-to-day basis, factoring out the extremes, right? And that puts us at 2.4%, which is where I'd like to see it. 2.4% is an inflation metric. It's an outstanding number. So now, as we move forward, two other things I'll talk about, and I'll wrap up. Labor markets and housing inventory, right? If you listen to the Fed, about 2 to 3 months ago, Fed Chairman Powell said we are in a no hire, no fire cycle. And respectfully, I'm going to disagree with that just because no hire, no fire would mean a 0% unemployment rate. We don't have that. So in DFW, what we do have is low hire, low fire. And you can see some metrics that I've laid out for you. The overall unemployment in America in January, 4.3%. That's high enough that the Fed doesn't call it low anymore. But in DFW, our unemployment rate was 3.6%. That is low enough the Fed would qualify us as low unemployment in DFW. December 25, our non-farm hire rate around the country was 3.3%. Same thing with our non-farm quits rate. And what that means is that people are not really hiring that aggressively. They're also not quitting their jobs aggressively. Right? So we're in a period right now that can accurately be described as low hire, low fire. And that just means everybody's waiting to see what happens next. Does that make sense? So the last piece we'll talk about today is the housing inventory and where we are moving forward. So as you can see in DFW right now, we've got about 5.5 months of active inventory. This is a balanced market. Anybody will tell you a balanced market can be anywhere from 4 months to 6 months. I prefer 4 months because I like there to be a little edge to my demand, right? I want buyers to have just a little bit of edge in the supply and demand. We are down, however, on a national level from an inventory standpoint. America usually produces about 5.2 million homes a year. Since 23, we're producing about 4 million. So on a national level, we're losing about 1 million homes a year to the level we should have produced. The last point I want to make is that home values have stopped appreciating in such a dramatic manner. If you've been in DFW, you've seen your homes appreciate 5%, 4% year over year since 2020, right? Well, last year in DFW, 87% of homes lost value. We have finally seen the plateau on home appreciation. It sounds bad. Here's why it's not. Because for the next 3 to 4 years, they're projecting in DFW homes will appreciate at 1%, maybe 1.5% if you're lucky. During that same period, we're projected to have wage growth in Texas of 5% annually. So if we have 4 years in a row where we have 5% wage growth and then 1% home price appreciation, that's a 16% gain in affordability. That's how we solve the affordability problem, and that sets us up for the 2030s to be a dramatically different decade economically. That's everything I have today. Does anybody have any questions? Sir?
Does the PCI include the home value?
Say it again?
Does PCI include home value?
It does, yeah. Structure, it's called structure. The element in it is called structure, and it's always going to be a major component of both inflation measures. For CPI specifically, structure is about 42% of the measure. So that's one of the reasons that CPI can be complex as a measurement, because if the housing market is struggling, it's going to make the inflation metric look like it's struggling as well, right? But if the housing market is successful, it drags the inflation metric down. So that's a really complicated discussion. Good question, sir.
Could you speak to the collection of data, particularly things of housing inflation rates, how they collect that?
Okay.
That's pretty outdated, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can see from the way that I'm displaying data that I'm talking about data from December of 25, and we're standing here in March of 26, just as an example of what he's talking about, right? What you have to understand about the real estate industry, and really our market industry as a whole, is that we collect data in arrears, right? We don't have up-to-date data. Jobs reports will come out, and then a year later you'll find out that there were 1 million jobs reviewed that we've lost since we thought we gained them, right? We have a very flawed, imperfect system of putting our data together to assume where we think we're going, and it makes it challenging. Is that fair? Awesome.